I think one of the hardest parts about being treated unfairly at work is that it's not always obvious. Like nothing big has happened, nothing overt, but something always feels off. And you can't explain why. And then you find yourself thinking about it later, going over it in your head, letting it spiral. And instead of getting clearer, it actually starts to build. Your mind starts going further with it. You start questioning things more. What did I do wrong? Maybe even catastrophizing it a bit. Thinking about what it means, where it's going, and what could happen next. And that's where it can really start to take hold. Because when people think about workplace bullying, they often imagine something really clear, someone being openly aggressive or crossing a line that everyone can see. But a lot of the time, it's not like that. It's quieter. It's a shift in tone, being left out in small ways, conversations that don't sit right or said as just a joke. And it's usually not one big moment, it's a pattern, small things that build up over time. And I think this is the part that really gets confusing because you can feel it, but maybe you can't quite prove it, even to yourself. So you start turning inwards. Maybe I've read it wrong. Maybe I'm overthinking it. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe I've done something wrong. And a lot of what you're trying to do in that space is to make sense of something that doesn't actually have a clear shape. You're trying to take something that feels vague and make it visible. And that's actually really hard to do when you're in it. And there's another part of this that can be really difficult, which is how other people respond. Because often you get the sense that people can see something isn't quite right. They can sense it. They might even empathize with you behind closed doors. But they won't always step in. And a lot of the time that's not because they don't care, it's because they don't want to become the next target. So you can end up in this position where you feel like people understand what's happening, but no one is really saying anything out loud. And when you're in that situation, it's actually really hard to advocate for yourself because you already feel exposed. So naturally, there's a part of you that wishes someone else would just step in. Someone would say, this isn't right. But that doesn't always happen, and that's really isolating. And over time, this doesn't just stay at work, it starts to follow you. You might notice it the night before, that low-level anxiety that builds as the day gets closer. Sunday evenings can feel heavy, like the weekend just disappears too quickly. You might sit in your car for a few extra minutes before going in. Take regular breaks to the restroom just to get away from it, just trying to get yourself in the right headspace. It's almost like you need a moment to brace. And there can be this shift where something you were once quite engaged in, maybe even passionate about, starts to feel draining. Like you're slowly pulling away from it, like it's just not worth it. And at the same time, you're not really sure who you can trust or how things are going to be from one day to the next. And I think that there's another layer to this as well that doesn't get talked about very often. There can be a kind of sadness in it, or even grief. Because if you think back to when you first applied for the job, there was probably a sense of excitement. You go through the interview process and then you get that email or that phone call saying you got it. And there's a moment of this is something new, this is a step forward. And there's hope in that, a sense of direction or purpose. And then over time, the reality of the job just doesn't match what you thought it would be. And that can be really hard to sit with. Because it's not just about what's happening now, it's also about what you thought this was going to be. And then there's the part that people often oversimplify. Sometimes you can't just leave. You might hear people say, if it's that bad, just walk away. But for a lot of people, it's just not that simple. There are bills, mortgages, children, responsibilities. Your whole life is structured around your job. So you can find yourself in a situation where something doesn't feel right, but leaving isn't an option. And that doesn't make you weak. It means your situation has real constraints. And the same thing applies to speaking up. You'll often hear the message that if something isn't right, you should speak up. And in many cases, that is important. But the reality is, it's not always straightforward. Sometimes speaking up helps, sure. Sometimes it doesn't resolve things the way you expect. And sometimes it can even make things more complicated. And that doesn't mean you've done anything wrong. It just means that these situations are more nuanced than they're often presented. Because these situations aren't just about courage, they're also about context. And I think there's something else worth noticing here. When behavior is subtle like this, it can feel very powerful, like the other person has more control than you do. But often, that kind of behavior doesn't come from strength. If someone was clear and confident in what they were doing, it wouldn't need to be subtle. It wouldn't need to sit under the surface. So when something shows up in that indirect way, it can sometimes reflect uncertainty or insecurity. And this doesn't make it okay, but it can shift how you see it. Because it means that what's happening isn't necessarily a reflection of your value. And I think this is where a lot of people can feel really stuck, because it can start to feel like there are only two options. You either put up with it or you leave. And in reality, that's often what ends up happening. But I think there's something in between. Not as a final solution, but as a way of holding yourself while you're in it. Because while you may not be able to immediately change the situation, you can start to steady yourself within it. To notice how much of your energy is being pulled into it, to bring yourself back when your mind starts running with it, to reconnect with your sense of competence, your sense of pride in your work, the parts of your job that are still yours. And something else I've noticed is the way you hold yourself in these situations can make a difference. Not in a way that completely changes everything overnight, but in how much power it has over you. Because when you're able to come back to a more steady place, when you're not getting pulled into it the same way, something shifts. Sometimes the behavior itself loses a bit of momentum because it's not getting the same reaction. And even if it doesn't fully stop, your experience of it changes. They don't feel as powerful. And sometimes that shift doesn't just stay with you. People who might have been quiet before, not because they didn't care, but because it didn't feel safe to get involved, sometimes they start to respond differently. Not always in obvious ways, but in small ways, more support, more alignment. A sense that you're not completely on your own in it. Because when someone sees that you're holding yourself in a steady way, it can create a bit more safety for them too. Not because you should have to carry that, but because these dynamics are often shaped by how people feel. And sometimes, without anything being said directly, you realize you have more allies than you thought. And I want to be really clear about something here. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm here to help you think a little more clearly about what you're experiencing, because you know your situation better than anyone. And one of the most important things in situations like this is protecting your sense of self. Because when something like this goes on for a while, it's really easy to start internalizing it, to think maybe it's me. But just because you're being treated in a certain way doesn't mean that reflects who you are. And just because it's subtle doesn't mean it isn't real. Your response makes sense. And if you're in something like this, it can feel really isolating, especially when it's hard to explain. But you're not imagining it, and you're not the only one experiencing it. And sometimes the first step isn't fixing it straight away. It's just recognizing what's actually happening and staying grounded in yourself while you figure out what comes next.